Hemshech Chaim Beis, Volume 1, Chapter 152. So, we're up to is Moichen and Midas is being used as the operative language now, the operative levels that connect the divine and existence. So Moichen in the human faculties, and also Lamayla and Atzilus, is essentially a level that is inward. As we learned in previous chapters, that the nature of intelligence is an inward and isolated one, which means it does not need another person, azulas, another. As a matter of fact, another person is mavalbul, confuses the process.
You mean seichel?
Let me speak. I mean, I don't know what the difference is. What do you mean? What's intelligence? And it's also not subjective. So it's real power is ability to relate to and conceive and absorb something that is beyond the self. So it's really a tool that allows you to enter into a higher reality than yourself. Emotions can't do that. Emotions, their entire being is all about what does it mean for me? What do I feel? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Am I attracted? Am I repelled? It's about subjectivity. It's about the human experience. Intelligence has the capacity, let's say imagination. You can imagine things. Imagine things that you may never ever reach. You can dream. You can learn about ideas that are not yet your level, so to speak. So the mind really has the capacity to take us to places that are beyond our own subjective nature. Animals don't have this. This is what we learned earlier in the previous Maimer discourse about Medaber, the power of a human being, power of intelligence. In that itself, we learned there are 4 levels of intelligence. Intelligence connected to application, technique, all the way to pure idea. She keeps saying when Atzmus HaMeichen in its purest form is devoid, detached from application, detached from any relationship with something else. Now, where's that ultimate of that? If we recall, if you remember, Atzmus HaMeichen, the ultimate is in Elikus, because all godliness is the only thing that itself is also beyond existence. As soon as you're dealing with science, he called that the tzemeach of the tzemeach of Medaber. The intelligence of communication is the chayav of Medaber. But true Medaber of Medaber, true intelligence in its purest form, as we learned, this was in the chapter, we spoke about the Medaber of Medaber, just to refer to it in Chukas. So it was, I believe, chapter 147. It's a mile called Lifnei HaTeva, the Ayin Eliki. So we bring it back to our Aveda. It's essentially the ability to go to a place that's beyond the initial natural inclination of a person, which is the self. The preservation of the self, the survival of the self, the growth of the self.
Beyond the default standard.
Right, exactly. But on the other hand, you want to come back to Midas. You can't just escape to imagination and dreams. You want to bring back to reality, the reality of your life. So hence, you need his bonanus that bring back the idea into awakening something, feelings within us. So in the last chapter, he's explaining, and as in all the chapters, he's explaining this so-called, what I would say, tug, this almost the tension between Moichen and Midas, between intelligence and emotions, between that ability to go to that place. And there's a place where they meet. So Moichen, all the way in its purest form, like he calls Chachma. All the way in Chachma is pure energy, you can say. If you go all the way to Malchus, you're going all the way into Kalim and containers. It's a pure application. Obviously in Biyah is already communication to outside of yourself, as he's been explaining. So in general, these are two types of Ilah V'Ol. One is an Ilah V'Ol within intelligence itself. It's like within Atzilus. She said, you speak to a student, it's still intelligence, even if it's in a diminished state. And then there's the Meichin and Midas thing. Midas is a Ilah V'Ol, cause and effect that's of a different personality, but it still has a very strong relationship with intelligence. It's born from it, comes from it. We're not talking about a Yesh Ma'ayin thing, complete Yesh and Ayin, even though he did speak in the earlier chapters back in the 30s of how Chachma is Yesh, Ayin and Bina is Yesh, and sometimes Midas is Yesh compared to, but that's all relative. But there is a relationship. The Midas are informed, the emotions are informed by the contemplation and by the comprehension. And in the second half of this chapter, that's 151, or the entire chapter, I would say, not just the second half, you have how the Hergish Aliki, which is in intelligence itself, the key thing is the sensation, the sense you have that it's divine, impacts the Hergish as the feeling and the sensation as it enters into our emotions. He explains how they're not the same, very, very different, but at the same time, they are, one comes from the next. And the way Midas come from Meichin is only from an outer dimension of intelligence and a reflection of it. Whereas the intelligence that comes from intelligence, like a teacher and a student, is also a reflection. And in many ways, it could be even lower than the intelligence that is informing the Midah in the teacher. But as far as intelligence goes, it's higher because it's still intelligence. It's not turned into an application or turned into an emotion. Now, to make it even more subtle, it's not just the Ilah from Meichin to Midas. There's also the Ilah, the cause and effect from the Midas Sheba Meichin. So there too you have already the beginnings of some type of application, but he explains that's still in the level of intelligence. So you have a me'ain, you could say it's almost like the two Ilah, one's cause and effect, same personality like a branch, that's like intelligence to a student. You have a different personality that's like emotions or application compared to intelligence. You can say the second one within the first one, and that is the Midas in Meichin. So now it's not just pure Meichin; it's already some application, but it's not Midas as Midas. It's in intelligence itself. It's still in what he called the Parzuf of Meichin. It's still the structure of intelligence. However, it's intelligence already beginning to apply itself, the inclinations it has, as he explained, and even all the way down to the Psak Din, even to when it will actually become an application, it's still all being informed by the intelligence. So we see that in intelligence itself you have levels as well. You have levels that begin to communicate or relate to something that's going to be ultimately of a different personality, even though meanwhile it's still Midas and Meichin, meaning the emotions and the emotions or inclinations in the mind are still all primarily intelligence. And then he says that in turn informs the Pnimius HaMidas. So in the Midas itself, in Aveda, there's a Pnimius of Midas where they are, just like the Meichin has a way that has Midas Sheba Meichin, the Midas also have an inner dimension of Midas. And I could say it's probably associated somewhat to Meichin and Midas. The godless, when the Midas become mature, there comes a point where not only they become mature, but they are actually assumed the dveikus, which is the type of absorption that intelligence has. So you don't see the excitement, excitability. So Midas too, you have two types of Midas. The external Midas, which is excitable, subjective, emotional. And then you have Midas which are far more sublime. Pnimis HaMidas.
That it burns quietly.
Yeah, you could say that, or if Ketayis could be Meichin, but you have Midas where the Midas are, like he says, Ein Sheyachim La'elamis. So they're not really relating to something else, they're really starting to relate. So in other words, it would be like I would say, once you contemplate on something and you begin to love it deeply, and it actually becomes love, there's the love, an external dimension which we relate to usually the things that are more the default states. And then there's the love that is now far more refined. It's a love that is very, very connected to the divine. It's still emotional, but it's Pnimis Hamidus. Okay. He also mentioned that in teacher to student there's also two explanations, but both of them are still all intelligence. Whether the olol, the effect, is it the seichel, the intelligence that's being transmitted from teacher to student, or is it the intelligence of the recipient that the recipient, and that the teacher has to apply himself how to explain things to him. But both of them, nevertheless, is still intelligence. It's not changed personality. It's still the process of an intelligent transmission. So, in simple English, bottom line is we have two types of transmissions. One that is far more related to an outer, to another, to a self, and one is related all the way internally to something that's beyond and higher than the self.
That Machem says, so mean this, the community is the same as Machem.
Not necessarily. I related it because there's some connection, because clearly as intelligence trains and educates, refines the emotions grow accordingly, and they become more refined as they are than they were on their own. Like if you talk about midas of nefesh habamis, they're basically hefker, whatever goes, whatever I want, whatever untamed, undisciplined, and not harnessed. What intelligence does lifts you to another place. That in turn affects your emotions. And there's a point here where the emotions start growing. We learned Yisrael Zutta was already a maturity of emotions. We learned back in chapter 139, I think, right? Actually, not 139, 135, 134. Yeah, 134. And it's a maturity of emotions where it's no longer just the plain, action oriented or application oriented. It becomes an emotion that is mature as opposed to a child's type. Remember the Moichin Dianika, the child's type of emotions that's undeveloped, but also Moichin Dianika. There's the different levels that he spoke about there. Moichin Dianika he called, if you remember, he said that was the stage where that's the stage of Yaakov. And in the fullest sense is when a child learns how to speak. But then there's the emotional growth, with like bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah, where a person begins to develop and they have control over their emotions. Ultimately, Pnimis Hamidus I think is higher than just Moichin Hamidus, but it's definitely affected by it. Well, the way he uses it here, let's see. So the primary thing is the Midas of Chachma, that's where the Dveikus is. Yeah, he says Pnimis Hamidus Shemer Behem Er HaMeichem Begili. Pnimis Hamidus is that in them is radiating the intelligence in a revealed way. To the point that they become like similar to the intelligence. I mean, you could see this. You could see, look, a person who's gone through this process and has lifted his hasaga, his comprehension, and his abundance to a refined level of divine. He's going to have, and it has an impact on his emotions. He's clearly going to have a different. His emotions are far more, are going to be far more sublime.
Isn't the word another good word? Feelings, like instead of emotions.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, that's fine. That's a good word. Yeah, because he's right now being drawn and attracted, like we said earlier. He's not attracted to Gashmis. He's attracted to Ruchnis. He's attracted to something that is eternal. So even emotions are now far more in a refined state. It's essentially what he says here. And they're not so much Hargosha and Ispilus. They're not so much into the... Like I give the example of the two people seeing a miracle and someone's appreciating the inner dimension of what's going on. So the miracle is more the Ispilus, the excitement of is more Chetzenisdik. And the other is far more pnimizdik and more lasting and more internal and therefore less obvious, less tangible.
Less noise around.
Yeah, less noise. Yeah, it's like in a way Yom Kippur compared to Shavuos.
Less static. Yeah. Less interference.
Okay.
When you're not tuned in correctly, it's less interference.
And all this, if you really tie it together, is a beautiful application of everything we've been learning, except he's talking about it far more down to earth, closer to us. But essentially, in a certain way, relatively speaking, Midas, a Meichen speaking to Midas, is more how the Er HaBligvul speaks to Er HaGvul. All that we've learned about that. How the transcendent energy is relating to that. Now, I have to qualify, because even Chokhmah is not Keser. We're not talking about Keser now. We're talking about, relatively speaking, the Ovis, what they're doing is expanding, remember, the parameters of Shaddai, to the point of Adli Dai, to the point of as far as you can go. So there's the bridge here that you want to connect. So Meichen here, this is where we are in the interface. If I would say Keser is here, we're talking about how Meichen and Midas are speaking. But it's all about this connection ultimately. And Meichen, as we will get to, that ultimately Meichen leads us to Keser, which will be Matan Torah, the Or Chodesh.
How Meichen and Midas are speaking within Meichen? Or?
You could almost say that Meichen compared to Midas is like the Er HaGvul in its root to the Er HaGvul in its Metzius, or even where Er HaBligvul touches Er HaGvul. It's clearly, but it's speaking far more now. He's not talking Lifnei HaTzimtzum, he's not talking before the Tzimtzum. He's talking already in relation to existence, and all the way down to Aveda, how it relates to us in our relationships. So when we are, for example, what I call the status quo, the default state, that's Er HaGvul concealed in a world like ours, and what dominates is our own personal desires, our personal material world.
Selfish interest.
Okay. This is what caused Chetei Tzadas, that concealed it all, to the point when Avram came, it was a world that was just busy with its own interests. Avram began to, what did he do? He began to reverse the process. He began to reconnect a world that is lost its alignment with its source, reconnected to what? To Er HaGvul first. And began to build and make the world simply aware that there's a God. To aware that basically Avram is like the process, the first Hizbonenus. That's what Avram did. He contemplated about God and taught people about it.
Conscious.
Yeah. And made people aware. And he began to expand that. The Ovis, that was the role of the Ovis, to begin to expand that. They're basically bringing Meichen into Midas. But not just Meichen, all the way, he's going to go all the way, almost not to Atzmus HaMeichen Mamish, because that's already Abba V'im Elon. But he said that the Ovis were primarily Yisrael Sabbat Tfuna, but it's still Meichen. That's why he keeps going back and forth. That even though it relates to Midas, he says, but it's still, Midas is still not pure intelligence. On the other hand, intelligence still speaks to it. He's going to conclude this. This is not my... he's going to actually say this in the Maimer, probably in this chapter, I believe, or the next. No, the next chapters, in the next few Maimarim. But this is not going off track here. He just went into a long explanation. If you remember, you have to always go back to those connecting chapters. Where he says, Lahav is but Taisrus beer, to understand everything we spoke about the Ovis we spoke about back in chapter 144. In 145 began this whole discussion where we are right now. To understand the difference between Hamshach L'Tzerech Hatzilus and Shach L'Tzerech Biyah, the difference between Cyrus and Asius. He went into the whole thing of, if you remember, Nekudah Sfira Partzuf, which led us into the whole thing with Medaber, which led us into two types of Ilava'ol. And now in Aveda. So it's all going to go back to what he began. He's going to go back to this, to back to 144 soon. So just for the record, everything we're learning on 145, we're now already by 152, 8 chapters, is all really a Tosfos beer in understanding what the others were compared to Matan Torah. But it's being brought down now in a very personalized level, because talking about Meichen Midas and how it's in Ayurveda. So this is how the others work in Ayurveda. We'll tie. The Rebbe Rashab is going to tie it all together, but I just didn't want to. I want to make sure we're on track here. So now we continue. So he's continuing still the discussion of Meichen and Midas. Now remember, we will get back to this. Meichen and Midas is also sometimes, as we shall see, is according to the Eitz Chaim, the Rizal, Iyu v'garmuhi is what? The Alter Rebbe says Iyu is Eris and Gamu is Kalim, but the Arizal says Iyu is Meichen and not Iyu. I'm sorry, Iyu is God. Iyu is He. Chayui is Eris and Kalim according to the Alter Rebbe. According to the Arizal, it's Midas, Meichen and Midas. And we said they're interconnected because intelligence compared to Midas is like Eir compared to Kalim. So let's keep that in mind. So which really makes the connection to everything we've been learning, Eris and Kalim. But this is obviously on a more, we'll call it a psychological, applicable level. Eris and Kalim is more so-called the philosophy behind it, the haskalah, the idea, Eris and Kalim. If you talk about it more in human application and how does it apply to us, application, I don't mean application as I've been using it in Midas, I mean application of those ideas that we learned earlier.
But they don't fuse like Oris and Kalim. Oris and Kalim has a complete fusion. And Meichen and Midas, did they ever fuse and become one? Like the same?
I would say yes.
Wow. And
they also remain separate. Like Eris and Kalim, with all the fusion, a Keli doesn't become an Eir. Even though the goal is the Keli should be refined like the Eir. Remember we spoke about Pnimis HaKelim? This all goes back. Pnimis HaMidas is like Pnimis HaKelim. Is it exactly the same thing? Of course not, because Eir itself also has, Meichen, its intelligence itself also has Eris and Kalim, and Midas have Eris and Kalim. So obviously, but that's the reconciliation that he's using. But you can say, in general terms, there's a certain similar Eir and Midas, Eir and Meichen are more similar than. But we also learned, if you remember, the Kalim multiply as we go downward. There's far more Kalim in Midas than there are in Meichen, and even more in Malchus. Remember we spoke about number and all that. So it all relates. Remember, in this context, you have to think of containers as being, containers has many meanings. Containers ultimately really means bringing the energy to others. That's what a container is, because it's not a physical container in Atzilus. So in a way, you can say that's a midah. That's intelligence being applied to something outside of yourself. You can define a keli that way.
Well, that's the Chutzanis of the Keli. Then, so you're saying the ultimate is the Chutzanis.
But no, the Pnimis HaKeli also. But the Pnimis HaKeli is still a container. It's still, remember, the difference between Chutzanis and Keli, Pnimis HaKeli, he said, well, Chutzanis HaKeli focuses on the structure. It's Chesed, Gvura. Pnimis HaKeli main role is to convey, is to express the air within it. But they're still both containers. We learned this earlier. Yeah, I would definitely say that the Pnimis HaMidas and Chutzanis HaMidas is very similar to Pnimis HaKelim Chutzanis. Look, this is going to be discussed more specifically. I'm just preparing us for the next stage. So just remember that's the connection will be made. It's not the Alter Rebbe. I'm sorry, the Rebbe Rashab in next Maimer is going to specifically say what I just said, which ties it all together. That's the key. And remember, even as you go through levels, the similarities are critical because they help us understand what does Eris and Kalim really mean in our Aveda. Someone said to you, what's Eris and Kalim in Aveda? Explain what that is. So one way would be explaining how Meichen and Midas speak to each other. Just as a... Okay. Va'inyan hu... Chapter 152. And the Inyan is... And he's continuing the discussion about Seichel and Midas, or Meichen and Midas. The Inyan in this is Hachokrim, the philosophers say, Chassidus says Chokrim, generally speaking, as opposed to, let's say, Kabbalah, the Mukabalim, the Rebbe Rashab, the Rabbeim will not call them Mukabalim usually. They'll call them by name, Arizal. Chokrim usually refer to the Jewish philosophers, like the Rambam could be a Choker, Yosef Alba from the Ikrim, the Rab Saadia Gaon, Amunas V'Deis.
Ramban also?
Ramban, no, they usually don't refer to Ramban. Chokrim are usually those books that I just mentioned. Chevis Levavos can be sometimes referred to even. Kuzri, yeah. Kuzri is a different style, but Chokrim are usually those that they deal more with. It's not Kabbalistic, but it's very philosophical. It's like philosophy without Kabbalah, essentially. Jewish philosophical. Mar Nevuchim is a classic example.
But the Goyim don't call them philosophical.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Chokim could, I don't know, Chokim could also include Goyim. I don't know, it depends. Philosophim is not used as a negative in Chassidus. Philosophim is often used very positively. That there, among the nations, there's philosophers who are able to detach themselves from Elam Haza. Torah uses it in a very positive context. I mean, sometimes it talks about Chachmas Chetzenis, but Philosophim
means Goyim. That means Goyim. Never called
often.
Philosophim, I think.
Here we do.
No, it's a different word. Chaykim or philosophy?
Chayker in Hebrew is philosophy in more, Philosophim is more. Chayker is a farsher, is a like a researcher, is an investigator. But Chakim usually refers to philosopher Chayker. Eimrim shalamayla lo yesh b'chinas hamidus klal. By the way, the Pardes sometimes also. Pardes, even though it's Kabbalah, but his Kabbalah is very Chayker, the Chkiridika Kabbalah, they call it. The Lamayla, above, there's no Midas at all. Because remember, he said something like this. The last line, the previous chapter, is that the Primus Midas are not related to the worlds, and they're Midas Atzmim, they're the core Midas of Atzilus. So he's coming to explain that. Okay, 1 second.
So you're talking here above Atzilus?
Yeah,
we're talking here above us.
No, in Atzilus. The Midas Atzmim of Atzilus.
Right. But I'm talking about the first line in Kupnan Bays,
Why is he saying that? No, not at all.
Because it's a mila. It's higher. It's higher up.
No. We're in the middle of a sentence. Don't jump to any conclusions. Trust me. Don't jump to any conclusions. I just want to see a line I saw before. Yeah, 4 lines from the end of the last chapter. Okay, the Lamaila above, there's no Midas at all. The Hari Midas and Ispailas Shemispal B'Chesed U'Kahai Gavna. Because Midas, by definition, they are an excitement. Mishpal, they get affected. They're Ispailas, I said, excitability. They're stimulated B'Chesed, with love, U'Kahai Gavna, similar. Well, Lamaila in Shayach in Ispailas, and above, meaning the divine, is what kind of Ispailas? We're getting excited about what? That's why they say, that above, you can only say it has an impact, a pu'ula of chesed. In other words, it's affecting things through attraction. Or it's affecting things through concealment, through withholding. But the midah, as we call it, an emotional feeling for something that excites a person, that has a spilus is more than an excitement. Spilus is an awakening of a sensation. There's no sensations.
Attraction, repulsion.
There's no sensations like that. It's an effect like that. That God uses chesed as it's like a tool to affect something in a certain way. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying now like this. So in other words, we have 2 elements to Midas. One is the impact of Midas, and one is the emotion of a Midah. And emotions, there's no emotions in Atzilus. It doesn't have feelings. It's not like affected by things it sees or things that happen to it. Here's what the Rebbe Rashab says about this now.
The Ula itself, I didn't understand the difference between the Ula and the spirals. Is it like being activated?
How could you compare the two?
Spilus is for himself, and Pula is affecting
A
somebody.
human being gets excited about things. God doesn't get excited. He just can affect. He uses chesed to extend, transmit, and Gvura is to control.
Activated, being
You are being spun about
to
something.
myself.
Yeah.
Means you're doing
Oh,
On a very basic level, God is not human. How could you apply to Him? You can't apply to Him emotional attributes. It's very simple. It's not very complicated. You can't apply emotional attributes to the divine.
Our feelings.
that's what they say. Like,
Yeah. Even when you say that God manifests in the divine image, you say God, Atzilus is a divine structure. It's a spheres. So let's say how the 10 hidden spheres are Lefnei Tzimtzum. Would you say that 10 hidden Chesed Lefnei Tzimtzum is excited about something? It's a power. God has the power to do anything. Since we see this Chesed in this world, you have to say that God has the power to do Chesed. Not because He has an emotion. He's not defined by it. He chose this tool. It's a tool, essentially. And by us, it's our structure. This is what makes us be what we are. We're defined by it. He's not defined by it. It's by Him. It's an instrument among many.
And we say God has seichel. We can say God has seichel.
Same way.
same way.
Same chakim v'lo b'chachmi yediyah. It's also an instrument.
Right.
But midas, it's even more obvious because midas, intelligence, you could say, divine intelligence. God knows, chose to know. Also, that is not like we know. I agreed. But midas is very specific. You can't say He's an emotional entity. In other words, when God sees something on this earth, it's not like suddenly He starts getting excited, like affecting us.
It goes back to the whole question of doing a mitzvah that you get excited about.
Right, exactly. But let's see where he's going with this. The point that he wants to make is that's what the Chokrim say. So etzem hamidus lo yesh lamayla. What we call real emotions, as we call in the human structure, emotions, reactions to things. Reactions would be also feelings. Don't exist above. It's like it says, "Lefi maisi ani nikre." When we say God has names, according to His actions, that's what He's called. It's called Elokim when He's behaving in a form of din. But you're not going to say God is a din, that He's emotional, like Shammai is Gvura. God is Gvura. No. This is a manifestation at that time of this. Now, obviously, it's going to be we're looking for the interface, so there's going to be a connection between our Gvura and God's Gvura. But God is not bound by it like we are. We are social animals. We're creatures of habit and we're creatures of emotions. You can't ascribe that to the divine. But you could ascribe a pool of chesed, that God behaves like a chesed. Just like we behave when we love somebody a kind way, we're drawn to them, we attract, we give. So too, that type of pool exists in the divine. But for us, it's an emotional experience.
If we're repelled by something, we withdraw.
Right, exactly. So he says like this: their assumption, or their basis, yeah, you could say the basis of their assumption, the basis of their idea, the core of the. No. Hanocha Shalom would be their approach, their perspective, maybe a bit. Hanocha is more than perspective. It's
like an axiom.
Axiom or assumption. Hanocha. Hu emes b'tzad echad. On one hand, it's true. U'b'tzad echad eina emes. And on the other hand, it's not true. He's saying very bluntly this. That it's true on one. That what they're saying, in other words, the point they're making, on one hand, is true, and on the other side, it's not true. The zeh emes. Yes, indeed, it is true. Shalamayla midas einam b'chinas ispailas. That midas lamayla are not an excitable type of experience. In other words, it's not like if you go to Atzilus, Chesed is bubbling with Chesed. It's not that bubbling experience. It's not like in that sense, like we understand his spailas. So to say but to say that there's no midas above, and it's only the effect, it's only pure, dry, so-called instrument or pula, activity, action. That's not true. Ein ze'emes. Diyesh midas l'mayla, midas ha'chesed, midas ha'gvura. Because there are actual midas l'mayla. We say there's a midah of chesed, a midah of gvura. That's not just a shema mushal. In other words, not just a metaphor. It's an actual midah called chesed. He didn't explain yet what this means. He's just taking their point and splitting it into two and saying one part is correct and one part is not correct. Va'adrab, heim tamid bebchinas isgalus lischased lisrachem. In other words, it's not a pa'ula. This almost sounds like the Shitta. If you remember, one of the Shittas about the Spheres is that they're completely. Remember, there was a Shitta in the Spheres that we're learning in this Maimer that the structure is in the Kalim and the Eiris are completely shapeless. In this discourse, he learns that the Eiris are definitely are shapeless relative to the containers, but they also have subtly shape. Then there's an opinion that the spheres are just simply instruments. They're complete creations. It's like God created a tool chest for himself. They're not me'ain, they're not eir. They're not me'ain the etzem. They're 10 tools.
It's not even part of the image.
Even the eir of the spheres is all basically 10 instruments, like a hammer and a screwdriver. They don't have the divine personality as we've been learning it. It sounds very similar. This is similar to this approach. So then the spheres are just pulas. They're just basically tools. Like you're not going to say, for example, that a tree and a table are spheres. You could say they're God's creatures. Spheres, the way we've been learning that spheres is an interface. It's a divine, infinite, chooses to have a finite 10 spheres and not infinite spheres. And that in turn goes to a whole process of Eiris and Kalim meeting, etc., etc. And even the Kalim are also divine. Here he's going the other way, that according to these Chakim, they say Midas are simply instruments, tools, actions. It's actions that God does. So he said on one hand it's true that it's not similar to us because it doesn't have excitability, it doesn't have that stimulation that we have. But on the other hand, you can't just say it's pure pu'ula. Because there is actually midah called chesed, a midah, an emotion called chesed. So we have to understand now what this emotion, because according to them it's far simpler. You could say, God is not human, God doesn't have any of this. He created tools to create a world, and we remain completely oblivious, or we become completely mysterious God's type of existence. You have nowhere where you meet God on our terms, where our midas meet God's midas. So he's saying, no, that's not correct. There are midas above, and you can't say they're just a pula, because according to their opinion, what does a pula mean? Only when he's doing it, he has it. What's an emotion? We have chesed all the time. Not only when we're acting on it, we have part of our makeup of our soul is we have chesed, gvura, teferes, we have chachma, bina, das. The only thing is sometimes it's dormant and just asleep, and sometimes it's awake and alive when something stimulates it. According to what they're saying there's no such thing as God has a midah called chesed. He has times that he chooses to act in a chesedic way, and that's it. And that's what he does. It's like, you wouldn't say you have a hammer inside of you. God has a hammer. When he needs a hammer, he uses a hammer. When he wants to transmit, he uses this tool called chesed. That's their approach. He says, and that's not correct. So what's correct is, you can't say that there's a midah of ispilus above. But to say there's no midas, that in Atzilus we're talking, obviously. We're not talking now in Atzmus and beyond spheres. Yeah.
It's a big difference.
Yeah.
But maybe they're referring to Atzmus.
Okay, that may be a reconciliation, but the Pashas they're not. Because they're talking there's no level where you have that. Well, we'll see. Let's review it further.
I mean, Deshit is more.
So you can't say it's only Pula, Ein Ze'emes, Adarabah. Hein Tamid B'chinas is Galus. As a matter of fact, on the contrary, the midah of chesed l'mayla is always revealed. By us, chesed is only revealed when you're acting on it. So you can actually say, I don't even know if you have chesed inside of you. L'mayla, chesed is always activated. Tamid b'chinas is galus, lis chesed, to do kindness, lisrachim, to be empathetic, compassionate. Gam be'esh she'einem po'elim pulas ha'chesed v'rachim, even when they're not actualizing it or activating it. So you can't say what they're saying is correct. What they're saying it would be only when the pool. In other words, there's no such thing as a midah. It's only by us that way, because we're defined by it. Above, it's shapeless, so to speak. There's no such thing. When God wants to act that way, that's what he does. It's a pula.
What does it mean that they're misspelling? They were not holy?
What?
They have no effect at all?
What?
Does it mean that they have no effect at all? They're just in the state of...
We're in the middle of reading. Let's see. I don't know. I don't speculate. Gam be'esh ein pelen pulas achaz varachem. Ki etzem amidas lamar einam mitzad hiseiris hazulas. Because midas, the etzem, the core midas above, are not because something awakened. By us, you have love inside your heart. You meet somebody you love, it's suddenly you feel for a child, a spouse, someone you know. Suddenly you see them, that sparks, ignites the love inside of you. L'mayla, there's no such thing. Mitzad hiseiris doesn't come because someone is igniting the midah in the Atzilus. Ki mitzad shleimus atzmus. It comes from the shleimus of atzmus. Atzmus is complete, and it also has emotions. It's complete.
Maybe you ignite the chesed. Maybe you ignite the chesed if you do a mitzvah.
Yeah, I'm sure that I thought of that as well. Let's read on. I don't think he means that. You definitely draw it down further. He means to say that, like by us, we need something to ignite it because I don't have. You can't say. See, it's not sudden. When you say a mitzvah does it, it's not because God is lacking chesed. That's why we ignite it. By us, a person, it's not ignited by you if there's no other person stimulating it.
Yeah, but we have it. It's just not ignited. It's something demonstrated. You can say he has it.
No. Why is it not ignited by us? Why is it not always awake? Because we're dependent. Because we're limited creatures. By God, He wants that mitzvah should ignite. But that's not what he's talking here. That the fact is, God's chesed is always b'shleimus. By us, if we don't have a person to give chesed to, our chesed will be compromised. That's what he's trying to say. There's no compromise there. Chesed is completely complete and full and so on. Anyway, this is a separate issue. That's he's speaking about it in that context.
It's a separate issue because even davening we say you're drawing down a new right?
You asked me a question, I gave you an answer. It's not sufficient, so let's read on. He's not talking about mitzvah. You see clearly he's not. No, a mitzvah is God wants. It's not because He's deficient. By us, we are human beings. Like you said, without someone to give chesed to, you have nothing. You can't have chesed. You can have chesed. God can radiate chesed. Look, for the first 26 generations, Nezunim b'chazah shel Kadosh Baruch Hu. So, like,
what is he adding by saying mitzad shleimus atzma?
That's the key. That's the key to the whole thing.
I don't understand it because you're talking about obviously whatever you want he has.
One last thing that you just said to answer. The 26 generations.
Yeah, but you could also say because there was a world that He wanted to give to. But you have to say, like, the fact that He created the world when there was no one there, so that alone tells you. So Shleimus is basically saying like this, look. They're suggesting that all these emotions are completely the human domain, the chakra, and that when we speak about chesed above, you're just speaking God's doing an action and so on. The Rebbe Rashab is accepting the fact there's no spilus. Yes, they don't have above. You can't speak about excitability and stimulation and feelings as we'd speak below. But to say there's no midas, there's absolutely midas. He didn't say this yet. But as a matter of fact, that's the source for everything that exists. The reason we have midas is because above there's midas, where they come from. But he didn't mention that. But what he is saying is the following. And the contrary, the midas below by us are can be activated, cannot be activated, and you're dependent on things outside of yourself to activate it. By God, He has b'tzad hishleimus. He has all the midas. He has chachma bina, because you can't say that He does not have everything within Him. So by Him, the midah of chesed is far more complete than our midah of chesed.
But you can't even say He has to have everything with Him.
Not has to. It's just that shleimus dictates that He has everything. It's not about having to. It's just the reality. What does shleimus mean? You know, it's like haloi ein what's the lashon? Haloi ayin.
You've trained us so much not to discuss atzmos.
We're not talking about atzmos. First of all, even you could. What do you mean atzmos? The God. We talk about the word God. If there's wisdom in this world, would you say that God has the power of wisdom?
If He wanted to.
Well, the fact that He created wisdom means that He wanted to. So that's it. Once He wanted to, that's it. And it's not about wanting. This is not the issue here. The issue is the opposite. The issue is our chesed is limited, and God's chesed is unlimited. It's always flowing, and it's not dependent on anything. I don't know what the problem with that is. What's the issue here? We're not talking here whether God. I mean, we're talking here about compared to midas by us. Our midah needs a seirus azulis, and God has it besides the shleimus. He has everything.
It's bothering me because he could have somebody sitting at home all day, but he wants to love somebody. He wants to give. I mean.
Yeah, but 1 second. And will he be frustrated if he doesn't find someone to give to?
Yeah.
Right. And God won't be.
Avraham Avinu.
Because he's shleimus, he has the shleimus of chesed. He has the shleimus of the chesed. We're dependent, and God's not dependent. By him, a midah is not because of dependence. It's a midah because he has everything. So he has also this. It's a very big difference.
So in essence, what's the difference? I'm saying, so the Chaykim would say that only when he's acting upon chesed is there something called chesed by God, and the midah would say that it's always a possibility even if he's not acting on it. It's a possibility that's the difference?
Not a possibility, that there is an entity called chesed all the time.
They would also say there's an entity, but when he wants to use it, he uses that entity.
That's not what they say. That's not how he interprets what they say. They say there's no such thing as midas
It's a tool, a hammer, that whenever he needs it, he picks it up and he uses it. Listen, right?
That doesn't mean there's an entity called chesed and gvura. There's no spheres.
Do we have to say that?
There's no entity until he
Something
moves.
like that about atzmos, if somebody's mean spirit or something, a negative midah. I mean, if he wants to have a negative midah, he can have a negative midah too. I mean,
Look, I would continue reading and learning it and see what he's saying, the whole subject, and we can analyze it as we go. Now, I don't want to draw I'm not going to draw any conclusions of where he's going with this. Let's see where he's leading us with this. I mean, there's many things to say about it. I'm not bringing in other stuff. No, there's the whole machlokes between the Rambam and the Maral. Chassidus brings. The Rambam says, "Hu amadu hu yideya," right? That he knows and is one with the knowledge. Hu amadu hu yideya hu yidua. And the Maral says you can't attribute das to God, because God is beyond das. So this reconciles that the Maral is talking about a lukus higher than Atzilus, and the Rambam is talking about a lukus in Atzilus. So of course there's a dimension where you can't apply. But we're talking about, is there such a thing, lamaila, in all called midas? Okay? That's the question here. Now, of course, there's a level which is beyond everything. That's not the issue. That's not discussing. He's talking lamaila. So mitzat shleimus ha'atzmus, there is chesed. I don't know. There's no problem with that.
anything you want.
Correct?
Is shleimus ha'atzmus means that there is a midah that doesn't need to mispoil? Or shleimus ha'atzmus is positive that there is a midah?
The latter.
The latter.
Where do you, then does it need to be poil? I don't know. I mean, the fact is that it's always there. Like he says, Gam k'she'enim poilim pu'ulus ha'chesed.
I mean, why does shleimus ha'atzmus need a midah?
He doesn't need. He doesn't say, where does it say need?
Well,
No, it's shleimus. Shleimus dictates that he has everything within him. He has the power to do spheres. He has the power of bli gvul. He has the power of gvul.
yeah, but here it's manifest.
Where's here?
In our scenario, what we're talking about.
No, it's not manifest. He says, Gam k'im, it's not manifest. It's there.
It's always there, even though it's not mispoiled, but it's manifest in fact that it's...
There's a midah called, yeah, that's what he says.
Yeah.
They say there's no such thing. It's only when there's an action. The action is chesed. We relate chesed to God only when he acts that way. There's no midah within a lukus that's called chesed.
Yeah.
I will explain it more, but I'm not going to explain it now until we. I like to hear what you guys are faster than me. You understand it already with a few lines. I'm trying to understand what he says, and then we can go back and understand.
We're fast in realizing that we don't understand.
No, let him read further.
I think you have to read the whole thing before you begin to analyze it. Because if you analyze the middle of something, you're essentially suggesting that you're like as smart as the Rebbe Shabbos. You're ready, even before he finishes the sentence, you already want to.
I think we have probably just a few terms we don't understand.
I think you should just hold up judgment in the understanding of this. That's what I would suggest. Let's just absorb and read. I mean, we talked about this. There's a whole chapter that he told us how to do that, right? I mean, you're seeing right here. What you're doing is, I am not trying to understand this whole thing. I'm trying to understand what he's saying. Let's just read what he's saying. Don't try to come to conclusions. You have to be patient. Can we all be patient a bit? Here's a perfect example. Your midas are getting in the way. Lukus, Al kain hintom b'chinas is galas gam kishen and poel and pulas hachesed. B'chinas midas ha'atzmim hem mitzad b'chinas ha'chochma shem b'chinas actus. Now midas, like it says, in the level of midas ha'atzmim, what he spoke in the end of last chapter, comes b'tzad chochma shem b'chinas actus, which is a state of total actus, state of unity. So what did he say in the previous chapter? If you remember, he said Chochma is dveikus. Chochma is complete absorption in the source, and that is in a state of achdus. Well, I'll just say this before we read on, because it may be helpful to understand the whole idea. Obviously, this is touching upon a very critical question. And this is maybe the thing that is disturbing everybody. And that is, it's one thing to say God is God, completely beyond us. We never understand Him. He's up in heaven somewhere. We're not in heaven or beyond space and time, the whole thing. He's here, but we have no way, common denominator. And we're creatures, finite, limited, and really there's no relationship. As I've said many times, like a master and a subject. And we shouldn't expect to even try to conceive of the creator when we're creatures. How could a creature relate to a creator? That would be the simplest approach to everything. That way you don't have any philosophical problems, you don't have any challenges, you don't have to reconcile anything. The problem is one small problem. That's not how God wanted it. And that's not how He made it. And God is far more complex than you can just get away by saying what I just said. It's even more complicated. What I said is God remains a complete mystery. But God is not bound by that either. He did create existence. So dilemma number one is this existence is God's handiwork. Where does that come? In the ultimate, in the purest, it could even be Ozov Hashem. And there are ways that I'm not. Yeah, I don't want to limit it to that, because that's also a level. I'm just speaking in very stark terms. You could even say it's a pure. I don't call it a pure approach, that we are simply subjects sent to earth to serve a master, and just accept that you're a servant. That's that. You have intelligence and feelings and so on. Like one guy once told me, that's like an assignment. That's just testation. You have intelligence not to use it. Basically, it's like God putting a temptation in front of you. Don't use your mind. He gave you a mind not to use. Give your emotions not to use them, to put them all aside and just submit. That's like the ultimate extreme of no relationship with God, pure, like literally a slave and a master and servant. However, for many reasons, it's not acceptable. Reason number one, logical reasons, and number two, Torah reasons. The Torah says that's not what God wants. He says v'yadaita, v'hafta. There's too many mitzvahs where God wants a relationship. How could He say know me how could we know the Creator? He said He created the human being in divine image. I'm not going to go through all the proofs. There's the logic of it also.
Maybe know me means that I'm there and you're.
Yeah, I don't go through. I'm not trying to make here a airtight argument. I'm just making the point. I'm going to just explain this in a moment a little better. I'm not really answering. I just want to put this in context so we'll understand what it's to do with this. So there are many explanations why that's not the way, and maybe above all is that God did create logic. And to say He created logic, not to use logic, is quite illogical. In other words, He created a whole system of a mind and all that for what? That we shouldn't use it? That we should be like animals and just feed and breathe and follow orders? Again, I can give other arguments. It's not a 2-minute discussion. This is hours. This is all of the Yisod of Chassidus, Yisod a relationship with God. What's a relationship mean? Shutef. What happened by Matan Torah? Was he just, what do we need a Matan Torah for that? He could have said to Adam and everyone, you're my slaves and just do what I want. What's this whole giving of a Torah to us? Learning Torah, understanding it, and making halachas. Why are we getting involved in the follow orders? Give us the orders and tell us what you want. Without getting into what would be the purpose of having puppets just playing out and free will. But the point is, it's not that way. Since it's not that way, we get into a far more thornier area now. So what do we do with this whole issue? Is God beyond us or is not beyond us? I go back to the interface question. I would say the whole Ayin Beis is based on it. All Chassidus, all Kabbalah is based on this fundamental question. Is he beyond or is he not beyond? The answer is going to be it's both. And they join. Why? Because God is beyond being beyond. So therefore you can join the beyond with the not beyond. Basically, in one line. That's nice words. The challenge is how do you do it? That God can do anything, we've already established. Of course, He can do anything. He can join finite and infinite. He can join dark and light. He can do whatever He wants. But that doesn't create a relationship. That's God doing it all. He wants us, with our finite tools and our limited perspective, He wants us to climb retrace the steps, climb this ladder. And He gave us tools to do so. And what are those tools? Tools that are divine tools. He created us in His image. That right away compels a very important question. Does He have an image? Does He not? So we learned all the way in the beginning, if you remember, in the beginning of chapter 5 it was. He said right away, that was the first Yesod in the beginning of the second Maimar. What did he say? That He has no tzelem. Ein lo guf, ein lo d'musar guf v'lo guf. Yeah, right. Chapter 5. Yet He chose, Ein Sof chose to manifest in a structure that's a divine structure which will become the meeting place where we can meet the divine. And the whole question is, how does that meeting place reflect the divine? And how does that meeting place connect to us? So we're constantly going back and forth. How the divine enters from Bli Gvul into Gvul, and how Gvul goes lower, lower, lower. And then how we, from Biyah and lower, all the way to this world, reconnect. Moichin Midas is a key bridge here, because Moichin is the mind that allows you to connect to something divine. Allows you to abstract. It allows us to get out of our subjective default state, which would render us always as creatures, and somewhat begin to understand our Creator. To put it that way. So the dilemma, and I think this is the core of this whole issue, is what the Chakrim say. Is far easier. Good, God is up there. There's no midas. He can pull us. He created servants. They need food. God sends them food. That's called chesed. They need discipline. God sends them judgment. So it's called gvura. They need compassion. He sends them a little compassion. There's no meeting point. It's God is the player. He's the puppeteer, and He's doing things to make this world work. I'm not getting now how they would explain Avodah and so on. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying, yes, it's true that the midas above are not like our midas, but to say that there's no midas is not accurate. There is a meeting place, and he's assuming that we've learned all the Maimarim till now that make it clear that there is a meeting place, that there's a place called Atzilus that allows. What does it say? Atzilus. The purpose of Atzilus is to know and to feel God. Remember, understanding God and feeling God. That's the purpose of Atzilus. Without Atzilus, God remains an entity that's beyond. We remain here. Atzilus is the place where the divine manifests in a structure. Does He have to? No, He doesn't have, but that's what He wants. So now we have to. So what He's coming to is, how do you understand these midas of Atzilus? So He says you have to say they're midas, but they're not frail and not subjective and limited like our midas. Ours are dependent. They cannot be stimulated. We get frustrated. We can remain very, very, very emotionally frustrated and empty. That doesn't exist in Atzilus. Atzilus midas are always active. They're active because it's shleimus ha'atzmus. That's what it is. It's atzmus, shleimus of atzmus as it manifests in midas. And then so we have atzmus that's beyond it all. We have atzmus manifesting in midas, and then there's how it comes into biyah, which is all the way down to our level with the midas lamata. That has the spirals and so on. Now, He's not coming to explain it all here, but I think I just wanted to put it in context, so just understand what we're talking about.
The shit that says no relationship with God, that he's out there, is also the same shit that says
I don't know. I'm not. You could develop a whole theory, but you have to really first study what all these Chacham say. I don't know. That Rebbe Rashab is using this Chacham to make his point. The Chacham may not go all the way to say that. They may just, but that needs research. You can't. Ultimately, yes, the conclusions of these points would be that there's a far less relationship, and it's far more. But they have philosophical reasons for it.
Right.
She says, "V'zeu hamavur b'makam acher." This is what is explained elsewhere. B'chinas midas atzmin u'mizad b'chinas achar v'shem b'chinas akdus. Midas atzmin u'mizad b'chinas achar v'shem b'chinas akdus. Yeah, that's what he said in the previous mimer. Okay, so now we've established that there's a level of midas atzmim, the way they are purely divine midas. Okay, I'll explain this even further, because I think where he's going with this is how actually from the midas of Atzilus become our midas. So they definitely originate from simply the divine power to have midas. Do you remember when we spoke about Gvul? And we said that ultimately we want to see the universe as being simply the expression of God's power of finite. Not that there's real Gvul. It's not about that there's parameters. It's that God. It's like seeing God in the structure, which is also godliness. So there's two ways to look at the structure. You could look at the structure and say, "Oh, the structure leads me to God," or you could say, "This is God's manifestation as He manifests in Chesed." We spoke about it a little also by the Haflah. We spoke about the Maven Dover, Meter Dover.
Spoke about the water and then the fire. That's Chesed.
That's so in other words, what I'm trying to say is exactly the ultimate goal when Mashiach comes is going to be you're going to see the world, the same world, but the world will no longer be defined by the worlds. It will simply be this is God's Chesed, this is God's Gvura. So there's in the purest form of Midas is not necessarily a relationship that is excitable. It's not Midas, until now we've been learning Midas is application. It's how you start relating to something outside of you. In Atzilus, Midas in its purest form is simply God's power to have a Midah. God's power to have Chesed, God's power to have Gvura, and so on. That's what he's saying. And that radiates in Chochmah, because Chochmah, everything is united there. And this is what's explained elsewhere. Just like He and His wisdom are one, same thing, He and His Midas and emotions are one. In other words, the fact that it relates in one line, he's explaining, because the primary is the midas within Chachma. In other words, let's spell this out. Remember we spoke about Yaakov, Yisrael Zuta, Yisrael Saba V'Tuna, and Abba V'Imei Loin, Meichem Be'etzem. We said all four are in Atzilus. But when you speak about, let's say, Asiya in the Medaber, your Atzilus is already relating to that which is outside of Atzilus. Remember, Atzilus is relating to Biyah. But how is Atzilus look at Atzilus? The midas there are not midas as applications, they're midas as part of the shleimus of Atzmus. They're part of the completion. God has intelligence, and God has application. How does that translate in us on a lower level? And a lower level would be we have the mind that applies itself to something, and we have the mind, the inclinations that the midah shebemeichen in our mind we have already inclinations toward this way, that way. In the divine you can't really put it that way, but then in the divine it's simply God wants a structure. That structure He wants is intelligence and midas, and in the way God wants it. That's how there. It's not because it needs it. It's not like the Moichin in Atzilus have to come into Midas because they're not complete. No, that's the way the divine expresses itself. First an intelligent idea, and then an application of the idea. You see what I'm saying here? In other words, we're trying to separate and say there's a part of our existence that is very similar to that, and there's part of our existence that's not similar to that. That's what he said from the Chokrim. So that what's not similar is that we are limited, and we need. For example, if you have a concept and it doesn't come into a feeling, it's a deficiency. By God, it's not because there's a deficiency; it's because the Shleimus dictates that Moichin, intelligence, should come into an application. So that's the root of how Moichin and Midas will ultimately be on this earth in our lives. So we can trace the steps, but yet also negate and say, but loy, like iu chesed, avalei b'chesed, like ours. So he connects, and where is it? Primarily radiates mostly in Chochmah Vatzilus, because in Chochmah is the root of it all, that's where it all begins. So in Chochmah you have Midas in their purest form. Midas meaning, what does Midas Atzmi mean? By us, like he says, Lamata Midas Atzmi means that in your mind you have already an inclination toward one way or another. Lamaila, it's Primius HaMidas of Atzilus. That's a Midas that's not shaykh to the world. It's a Midah, meaning Shleimus Atzmas dictates he wants to have Midas. That's what he's saying here. What I just said, understood or completely cryptic? It's one of the way or the other, or both. All the above. Okay. Well, we're definitely going to explain it more. I have to explain it in many ways, but that's clearly what he's going. This is very brief and needs a lot of explanation because he's bringing together a lot of things. And when you read this, you really need to depend on a lot of what we learned earlier. It's not in a vacuum any of what he's saying here. But what this chapter is doing, he's going back to the interface. How much of our side, I'm talking about the human, relates to Atzilus, and how much is different. The Chokrim say it's all different. And he says part of it is different and part of it is the same. Just keep that in mind. It's a very important point. The explanation of that, I think we'll get after we learn a little more. I try to give a little explanation, but that's the key thing. It's different because we're deficient. We're bound by our midas. Like you cannot exist without love. God doesn't need love; He could exist without it. But Shleimus dictates that He has it.
He dictates that He has it.
The Shleimus, I said. Shleimus means that He has everything, so He has it.
Yeah.
And Chochmah becomes the key. The key residence of where these meet. Because in Chochmah, it's the spark that just begins the transmission Atzilus and has within it everything that's going to come. It's like the Bereshis Nam and Maimerhu that we learned. Amir Achas. It's
like the womb that contains everything in it.
Not even a womb, that's Bina is the womb. It's the spark, it's the seed. Okay. Shezeu Ikra Atzilus Mashem Abchinas HaChochmah Dafke. That's the Ikra Atzilus Mashkos Makmacher Vizbar B'Samuch. Like as elsewhere and explained shortly, or close by, soon, Samuch. So, because remember, when we say Chachma is Mekanana, is nested in Atzilus, Bina is Mekanana, is nested in Bria, Zoh, and so Atzilus Shabbat Atzilus. Remember, we learned that Atzilus Shabbat Atzilus is Chachma. Like the Yud Kei Vav Kei. The Yud, the whole thing in Atzilus, the Yud is the primary force. That's Atzilus. So what happens there is that you're sensing the Shleimus. I can explain this with more explanations, but I want to read it a little more, and then I'll explain it further. Because Sheheim b'bchinas Agdus Mamash. There it's complete unity. What time do we have here? And this is the difference. Okay, I better explain this before we go on here. This is already going next level here. Going back to that philosophical quandary, how do we unite a finite world with an infinite God? and from our perspective, not from God's perspective, Mars. So there's the two options. You either annihilate the world, and it is absorbed in the divine light, or you compromise the divine light, and the relationship with the divine is only on a lower level, and the Atzmus remains completely removed. Those are usually the two options. So in the first one, you have Atzmus, but you have no relationship with him. You have to annihilate yourself. Let's speak in relationships. Two people can't connect. One has to disappear for the... comes the third approach, like Tiferes, the middle path, that says no. There's a meeting place. That divine Atzmus manifested himself in Eir Rotzen, all the way to Eir HaBligvul. Eir HaBligvul, the infinite possibilities, chose one possibility, 10 spheres. Those 10 spheres went through a Tzimtzum and Eris and Kalim and Akav and the whole gradations until Atzilus, where it becomes a structured archetype of the pure universe. Its existence in its purest form. Everything is aligned. Then comes a new stage, a parsa, and a new tzimtzumim, and now biyah, a separate world that's starting to be, now doesn't even sense that it's related to the source. All the way to tachten, shen tachten, lamaten meno. In our world, mole klippus v'sita achra. Here we can deny and say me and nothing else, and everything is reversed. Everything that was once real here is completely ignored, and we think we're real. Okay, clear? Now starts the process, how do we get back? So Atzilus is the key. It's the station, where the meeting place. Because Atzilus was where the structure, the divine powers for structure manifested. We are far lower than that. So we realign. The Ovis do this job, by the way. The Ovis set the stage. They set the ground. They worked, this pioneering work that they did was taking a world that was detached. 7 generations, right? When it went from the Shechina B'Tachtenim all the way to the 7th heaven, reconnecting. Bring the world back to Atzilus, basically. As much as possible. Which also requires more power than just Atzilus, etc. It requires, like he says, also power from a higher... But it's basically realigning. If you can reconnect existence to Atzilus, you have the hope then you can reconnect Atzilus to back. Atzilus is your key ticket back to Eir HaGvul Lifnei HaTzimtzum, which connects to the Eir HaBligvul Lifnei HaTzimtzum. That's the key. Now, so the point is, the Atzmus is not a factor here because Atzmus is not affected by any of this. Atzmus wants it all. That's all that you have.
So if we can collect our Gvul, which I can understand, are we still trying to? Is that we're going to try to jump to Atzmus, or is it
Atzmus you have a connection with right now, even if you don't have a connection. There's no word connection doesn't apply there.
No.
You're talking about appreciation. You're talking about if you can appreciate. Of course, the higher you go, the more you'll appreciate. The more you figure out God's structure and beyond structure, the more you'll understand Atzmus. Simple as that. Will you always go? Do you get total Atzmus? Obviously, we're not Atzmus. We're never going to get total Atzmus, but you'll be able to look at his face by not looking. Let's put it that way. So you're talking about, you want to, Dr. Lang wants to meet Atzmus, right?
Nice to meet you.
Okay. That I don't think is going to be exactly quite that. It's not going to be quite that way. It's basically when you will go through all these levels and they'll refine you, then you'll experience Atzmus in ways you cannot experience now. That's simple as that. There's no other way to put it. There's no shortcut. You can't go there because Atzmus is here even if he's not here in your terms. So his relationship is with you no matter what. But that's not on your terms. All the levels, which is also what God wants, is a way that Atzmus wants you to connect to him. You need to use your seichel and so on, because you are a creature of intelligence and emotions. You're not Atzmus. So how are you going to relate to something that doesn't have any of that? So God says, I put a part of my Atzmus into my Moichin and Midas. And if you use that, you can come to me. And there's the Gvul power, there's the Bligvul, there's the Bittul, there's the Pnimius, you have to go through, it's the whole process. There's no one key. It's all the steps. It's not just Chesed, you need Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, you need it all. You work with all of that, and it opens up those doors. And yes, you will come. That's what Lasad Lavi is. Ayin b'ayin yiro, you know that we will have that type of relationship. But that can be talked about, that can only be experienced. That's the key thing. And the experience is hard to, you can't talk, how are you going to describe an experience that we've never had? But clearly the experience would be one that will permeate existence and still send something beyond. And I'm sure in that itself there are levels. Even when you say Gvul and Bli Gvul, how many levels of Gvul are there? How many levels of Bli Gvul? It's not just you hit Bli Gvul and then, okay, let's move on. It's probably... And remember, we also don't think then in terms of, okay, I'm at the Kingston Avenue station now, when we're getting to the Nostrand Avenue station. You don't think in terms of... the whole thing is not defined by our limited type of goals or something like that. But I want to go back to what I was saying. So the key thing to understand is that the way we look at the structure of existence and the way Atzilus looks at the structure of existence is very different. And the way Eir HaBli Gvul looks is completely different. The way we look at the structure of existence is, here's an existence, like we say, we're physical beings going on a spiritual journey. Atzilus looks at existence, no, you're spiritual beings that was sent on a physical journey. It's a whole different reality. Existence is simply God's playground, if you want to put it that way. It's God's
hobby.
It's God's fingers. It's God's energy. It's divine energy. This is divine energy. We don't see it that way. We see containers. We don't even see containers. We see klippas. We see
mud.
We see the
surface.
We see the nails.
The nails. We see the potato peels. We see, the surface of the surface. Even we don't even see subatomic particles, let alone the deeper stuff. Okay, but we understand. We relate. Fine. Atzilus sees it from the inside out. What are you? You are Chesed. You are Gvura, so on. You're an expression of God, of godliness in the Gvul. Remember, we're talking Gvul now. We're not talking about Bli Gvul. Your expression, everything in existence is a configuration of spheres. Everything. Colors, creatures, Daimim, Tzemeya, Chaim, Medaber, the heavens, earth, everything is either Chachma with Chesed at work or Chesed within Chachma and Bina. The configuration. 10 spheres, 10 Maimaris that have all the permutations that end up being the multitude of existence. Someone that sees it that way sees this all Elokus manifesting in so many diverse ways. But the diversity is real. It's not an illusion. It's not like they're saying it's only a pu'ula, that only an action. It's real. It's a divine structure. It's a divine universe. Okay. And the universe will not be annihilated. God wants trees and birds. And He wants red and blue and green, and He wants you and me to be different personalities, etc. There's men and women, and there's different nations. He wants this. However, we see it as fundamental structures, and we're saying, there's someone put us here. And Atzilus sees it, no, these are divine tools. This is part of divine shleimus. Shleimus is what? He's an artist that has millions of colors at his disposal. So if you look from those eyes, it's a color. It's a divine color. We're not getting now to, is God bound by color? Obviously, you go deeper, he's not a color, He chose the color. And the color will lead you to, remember, colorless, white, all the way to the source that's beyond color. But don't jump there. Let's just discuss, let's just align existence to this perspective. So then when you say Midas and Atzilus, when we say Midas by us, I'm relating to you. When I'm using my intelligence, I'm detached. I'm focused, absorbed in my idea. I go to my place. Amida is already azulas, like he says, another, a nifrid. Dover shenifrid b'mena, right? To keep using the word, something outside of you. God wants that, but Amida is going to be, like he said, an outside experience. It's informed by his bananus. That's the Aved. But how is this? That's in us. How does this play itself in Atzilus? Atzilus is a Hisbonus and a Glamida. Remember, Atzilus is a perfect world. It doesn't need a contemplation because, first of all, it doesn't even have an Nefesh Habamis. But beyond that, everything is functioning there properly. So he's explaining in Atzilus, the whole thing plays itself out more as divine tools. God has the tool of intelligence. God has the tool, I say use the word tool. God has the Midah, the attribute of intelligence, has the attribute of Midas. In Meichin, in Chochmeh, it's basically all united. When Zah emerges, it's like he said, through a window. What does that mean? That you don't sense so much the unity within the divine. This will ultimately become a root with enough tzimtzumim to what we call moichin amidus in us, where there's actually an intelligence and you relate to somebody else and so on. That's the difference to how it's Lamaila and how it is Lamata. So we have something very similar to Atzilus. We have all the factors are there, but there's a key difference. We're human. Atzilus is not human. Atzilus is divine. So it has all the components in the engineering room, except they're like in an archetype form. And we are the prototype, basically, in a human form with all the limitations and deficiencies. Like, for example, that I'm reminding now that Derech Mitzchachi asked a question. I'm trying to remember what it is. Moich shalat al-alev. How is that possible in Atzilus? In us, it makes sense. Our emotions are very wild, or etc. And our mind tells our emotions, listen, slow down, and tame your midas. What does Atzilus mean, Moich shalat al-alev? So clearly, the means there doesn't mean the emotions are wild in Atzilus and they need someone to discipline them. In Atzilus, the midas are a force that are beginning to relate to existence, and the intelligence is a force that relates more to the divine. That's in a subtle form that will evolve into what we call Meichin Midas when it comes into a world that is not aware of God. So basically what you have here is a far more complicated system. So you have everything that exists here exists in Atzilus, except in Atzilus it's in a divine state. And that's why this needs so much discussion, because that divine state is what we're not really so familiar with. It's the whole point of learning Chassidus. That's really what he's going to here. That's why we have to take this slow. I don't think we should even continue with the Chochmah and Bina, because it's going to make things very complicated.
Connected now to this Chochmah is Reishis and Bina is Mokir. That's why you started this whole...
Yeah, but it's also in general Atzilus and Biyah. It's the same idea.
So Bina represents here... Yeah.
Bina is already, yes, it's how Chochmah represents Atzilus in general, where Midas are in its purest form. The equivalent of Chochmah, of Midas and Chochmah, Lamayla and Atzilus in us, is when your mind is starting to have an inclination toward Chesed and Gevurah. By God, that's not really the case, because He's B'Shleimus. What in Atzilus it is how Meichin has in the Shleimus of both going towards Chesed or toward Gevurah. So the Chokim are right in one way, that it is definitely not like us. It's not like in other words, God doesn't need to say, okay, you know what, enough theories, let's now figure out, are we going to rule Chesed or Gevurah? You could say the moment Chachma begins, He already knows which way it's going to go. Doesn't need this whole processing. But He wants the stages. So for us, it's more of a process, because as I said, we're limited human beings. We don't just, you need to study for hours before a pilpul, through Meichin, before you get to Midas, before you know an inclination. In Atzilus, Midas Shebemechin is the idea of Midas Atzmim. It's the Midas, the power of Chesed and Gevurah, as he's conceiving it in his mind. That's the key thing I was really saying. And it's a very abstract idea, but it's clearly where he's going. He wants to explain the difference between Lamayla and Lamata. It's clear, you see Lamayla and Lamata. Well, this is forcing us to go into a place. Look, until now we were just speaking everything in the context of your nefesh habamis is a control. You have a contemplation and a meditation, a comprehension and contemplation on divine. It elevates your midas. But what does that mean in Atzilus? How does that play itself out? That's what he's going back to now. We'll continue. Let's stop here.
So also for us, Atzilus game is also where we are.
With the bottom of page 298, the beginning of chapter 152. Yeah, we can stop. We'll stop here.